And let's talk about food. Let's talk about wine. Let's talk about books. Let's talk about movies, art. Let's talk about literally anything else.
And I think it kind of represents the evolution of MAGA, right? This is a more intellectual spot, and that might surprise people that MAGA is now gravitating towards that, but we see more and more intellectuals coming into the fold.
Yeah.
And so was that part of the calculus when you were coming up with this concept that politics was shifting and that these people were homeless in DC in terms of the restaurant scene?
I want to confidently say, yes, I'm a genius. I saw all of this coming. But the honest to God answer is this is just the only thing I know how to do. So my first few restaurants were a lot like this. They just didn't happen to have the same crowd. They had a different crowd.
Welcome to the Golden Age. I'm your host, Andrew Zucker. This is the spot where politics and culture collide, and I'm so excited to have you with us. On this first episode, it's a really cool guest, Bart Hutchins, the man behind DC's most buzzed about restaurant at the moment, Butterworth's. It's the watering hole for MAGA, and it's a fascinating conversation. We talk about how he came up with the idea, the concept behind it, how he got everyone from MAGA world to come to the restaurant, whether Democrats are dining there, and we also talk about whether or not Mr. Trump will make an appearance at the restaurant. Let's take a listen. Bart, welcome to the Golden Age.
Hey, thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
So your place, Butterworth's, features a who's who of Trump world. You've got everyone dining there. How did this place become the watering hole for MAGA?
Oh, gosh. That's a great question. And I wish I knew the complete answer, but like any scene, it sort of happened organically. It started when we were opening the restaurant and seeking outside investors to get us over the finish line. And I met Raheem Kassam. Have you met Raheem?
I haven't met him.
Really, really fascinating guy. So British guy, was chief of staff to Nigel Farage during Brexit and all of that stuff. Moved to America, sort of was a big part of Trump world. Now runs a news organization called the National Pulse. But he's a huge foodie and a huge loves a martini he calls a filthy monkey, which is a dry gin martini with Monkey 47 gin and a lemon twist, which is unique and all his own. Loves caviar, gets it shipped to his house, is sort of obsessed with food and dining and drink and culture. And so we hit it off because we drank at a lot of the same bars, and I didn't really know him in a political context at all. And was like, hey, do you want to invest in this new restaurant? And through that process, figured out who he was, which he's sort of this...
He was Steve Bannon's co-host.
Yeah, he was Steve Bannon's co-host. He's sort of this, he used to host all of the parties at CPAC back in the day. Sort of this party magnate of the right. So that was a big part of it. And then we started booking private events. We have a very large private event space at the restaurant. So part of what we have to do to make the economics of that work is we have to have private events constantly. And being this close to the Hill, we ended up doing a lot of political events. And so then Steve was hosting events there. And then inauguration came around and everyone and their mom hosted an event there. I think we had 18 events in that 1 week. We were basically closed the entire week, completely bought out for the entire week. And then through that sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Through that catalyst giant event that inauguration was, a scene just formed around the place. And all of a sudden, you're seeing members of the cabinet there, you're seeing members of the media there, and it's become this watering hole for them that that every night there's somebody there that you're like, what are they doing there?
Are any Democrats dining there?
Oh, plenty. Plenty. That's the part that I wish we got a little more. The story of these sort of right wing firebrands is so interesting that we don't get picked up for any of the Democrats that are there. And without giving away client names, because that's a big, huge faux pas in the restaurant business, I would say 12 to 15 members of Congress who are Democrats have been in. A few of them are in 3 or 4 times a week. But that doesn't get written about because it's not particularly interesting right now. But I have a history in this neighborhood. I had 2 restaurants in the neighborhood previously. And they were all sort of that way. Because the Hill it is the industry of this place. If I was in New York, I would expect my restaurant to sort of be full of artists and models and bankers, or whatever those major industries are. And if I was in LA and you do a good restaurant, you sort of expect it to be full of actors, actresses, producers, directors. And in DC, if you're on the Capitol and if you do something well, you should expect sort of the entire political establishment to adopt it. And that happened with my first 2 restaurants to some extent. and has happened with this one. But I think the addition of Steve and some of the more like fiery brands within that thing have sort of made it it's like a really easy narrative, a really easy story to write.
And you've cited Spago from LA as an inspiration for this restaurant. Tell me about that.
Man. I mean, it starts with the fact that like I'm a huge dork for restaurant history, right? So Spago, and then up in San Francisco, there was a place called Stars. Are you familiar with Stars?
I am, yeah.
Jeremiah Tower's restaurant, right? So there were these restaurants in the 80s, and maybe it was because everybody was like doing cocaine or I don't know what, but these restaurants that just became scenes and became like the entertainment for the evening. So one of the big things that we're experiencing in dining right now, and this sort of started in the 80s and really culminated with like the David Chang foodie, hashtag foodie era, was that more and more in America, there's less and less live entertainment. There's not as many plays to go to. There's not as many concerts to go to. There's not as many shows to go to. So the chef and the restaurateur became this thing you went and did at night, and that was the entire entertainment. And so there's versions of that where like the food is so interesting that it's entertaining, and it's this like really intricate chef, and he has a chef's table episode, and he like makes this thing with tweezers that just blows your mind. And the other version of it, which I'm really interested in and have studied quite a bit, is the crowd and the scene that comes there is the interesting part. And being seen there and seeing people there is your entertainment for the evening. And so Spago was a really good example of that. Was filled with like every star in Hollywood. The Stars up in San Francisco that Jeremiah Tower did was very much that way. It was like the who's who, from the mayor of San Francisco to the titans of industry, to the cool artists that all live there were there. In New York, we've had a billion iterations of it, because if something happens in the world, it happens 100 times in New York. Right now, the most interesting place is called Dudley's. It's like an Australian all-day cafe, but like Sarah Jessica Parker's there 3 times a week. So like there's something, and like the Hadid sisters are there. It's this like very chic sort of hangout. In DC, like the running joke, like the old time joke is like DC is Hollywood for ugly people.
Right.
So when we built Butterworth, I was looking at Spago, looking at Dudley's, looking at Stars, and saying, okay, if this is our Hollywood, like who's going to be in the room? And it's happening, which is really, really exciting.
It's Kash Patel, it's Speaker Johnson, it's Steve Bannon, Secretary Bessent. How are all these people coming there? Is it word of mouth? Are you inviting them?
I think it started as word of mouth, and then it just gained momentum, right? Like in this era of social media, like everybody sort of tells you where they are all the time. And it just hit this like momentum point. All of a sudden, it was like if we had one notable name a week in the first month, we were like, wow, that was a really big night. Like, so glad they came in. Like, such an honor to have them. And by the point we are now, which we're almost 6 months in, if there's a night without 2 or 3 of them, I'm like, oh gosh, are we losing our juice right now? Is it over?
And what are they like? I mean, have you spoken with Kash or Steve? You've spent a lot of time with. What are these people like?
Yeah, I'm there every night, so I've spoken to all of them. They are, and I'm making generalizations because they're all obviously very different, but they are all sort of in different ways tremendous like fans of food and drink. So one I'll give away because he gave it away. Nigel Farage was in last Friday for lunch. We had like a 4-hour lunch. He has this thing, and I wish Raheem was here to tell the story, called a PFL. PFL stands for what's your cussing policy on this?
Go for it.
PFL stands for proper fucking lunch. And so you start with some gin and tonics, and then you move into the lunch, which is 3 or 4 courses at lunch, more or less a bottle of wine per person. And then once you've done that and you've had a little bit of sweets at the end, then he sort of announced, like, we need to have a cleanser. And I was like, what the hell is a cleanser? And it turns out a cleanser are pints of ale to help you wash out all the wine. And so this is a 4-ish hour lunch that involves gin, wine, ale, and multiple courses, including dessert in the middle of the day. So needless to say, at the end of it, I was wrecked. I was done. Like, that was it. I had to go home, take a nap. But Nigel was like, all right, time to go back to work, which is this like tremendous, maybe it's like a British cultural. I don't
very
even think
British of him.
It's very British of him, but it's also very like superhuman of him. Like anybody that can do that multiple times a week is some sort of otherworldly. So all of them have that thing in them in different ways. They're sort of like tremendously good eaters. They're tremendously interested in wine, tremendously interested in food, and want to talk to you about it. And I think there's some relief from having to talk about politics all day to talk about this thing that's much more human, in my opinion, at least, and also, in my opinion, much more interesting.
So even though it's seen as this MAGA world hangout, they're not talking politics inside.
No, almost never. It's a restaurant that's open to the public. Like maybe if it was like a private dining or like something like that, maybe they would be making deals or arguing about the next policy. But I think it's more than that. I think they're there to get away from all of that stuff. Part of the inspiration for the place was Ernest Hemingway's Death in the Afternoon, which is a nonfiction book of his. 300 pages of this very technical bullfighting stuff. And then the last chapter, he sort of just throws it away. He says, bullfighting is really interesting. I love bullfighting. I'm very passionate about it. But what's way more interesting is being in the cafes after the bullfighting and getting drunk with the picadors and the bullfighters and the people associated with that industry. And I think that when you're talking about like what they talk about at Butterworth in the evening, that I see a lot more of that than I see of like the political stuff, which is like we spend all day in the sort of public arena doing the bullfighting of politics and putting on the show. And let's talk about food. Let's talk about wine. Let's talk about books. Let's talk about movies, art. Let's talk about literally anything else.
And I think it kind of represents the evolution of MAGA, right? This is a more intellectual spot, and that might surprise people that MAGA is now gravitating towards that, but we see more and more intellectuals coming into the fold.
Yeah.
And so was that part of the calculus when you were coming up with this concept that politics was shifting and that these people were homeless in DC in terms of the restaurant scene?
I want to like confidently say, yes, I'm a genius. I saw all of this coming. But the honest to God answer is like, this is just the only thing I know how to do. So my first few restaurants were a lot like this. They just didn't happen to have the same crowd. They had a different crowd. So I wish I had planned that, but you're absolutely right that they are, that there is a big difference between this administration and the last administration. I had restaurants during the first administration.
During the first Trump administration.
And these people weren't there, right? The watering holes. I mean, Trump Hotel was this sort of like massive.
That was ground zero.
Gravitational pull.
Yeah.
And even then, like, I don't want to sound like I'm talking bad about a restaurant that's closed because that is a mean thing to do. But like, it was Johnny Walker Black. It was like ribeyes. There was still steak sauce and all of those things. And what you saw was a movement of like outsiders that had taken over. And we're sort of like grappling to get power. And now you see a much more sophisticated group of people who have gone from being outsiders that wanted power to people who actively have power. And I'm watching them in real time sort of learn how to carry themselves in that way. And I think there's a huge jump that's happening. I think like, a lot of these people during the first administration, Trump Hotel, a handful of dive bars. There's a place called Harry's that a lot of sort of like the real outsiders were at. And now we're sort of in this circle and you see like, Scott Bessent's a very serious person. There's more of that on their movement. They have intellectuals behind them. And they're learning how to carry themselves with the power that they now hold.
And Trump World's favorite restaurant has no beer on its menu and no hamburgers. So that might sound surprising to people.
Well, so we no hamburgers, and I'm not doing a hamburger. I've done it. I've sort of won awards for it, and it's one of those items on a menu where if you put it on there, it's the only thing people order. And as like a chef, as like a food person, it drives you insane. But we do have beer because like I'm a Guinness loyalist. I think it's like there's like great wines. There's like the Bordeaux's and the Burgundies and the Bandals of the world. And then right below that, as far as products that are made by humans that we consume, I think Guinness is right behind them.
Take us through the menu. What are the most popular items?
Oh, gosh. We sell, I think, so I'll start with drink. I think we sell more Guinness than any place that doesn't have like O'Doul's, McKinney's, an Irish name in its thing. So that's huge for us. We sell a lot of Guinness. We sell a ton of natural wine. So if you're familiar with Kermit Lynch, he was a wine importer from Berkeley. He sort of pioneered a lot of these like low intervention organic wines. We were like one of his biggest accounts in DC. We sell a ton of his wine. And then as far as food is concerned, we're selling a massive amount of sort of what's called offal in the restaurant industry, which is like offcuts. So it's not a ribeye. We're selling a lot of foie gras. We're selling a lot of bone marrow. We're selling a lot of like feet and heads and organ meats. And that's been super interesting. So I've been doing on the cooking side. I was a chef before I was, primarily just like a restaurateur, and have been cooking bone marrow and pig's feet and head cheese and those things for, I don't know, a decade now. And so early on, my crowd, like my following, was sort of like older Berkeley hippie types and like young hipsters who like watched food television. And now I've got like GOP staffers, like chief of staff to XYZ person being like, hey, so I'm going to get the bone marrow, like really need to focus on my collagen this week. It's become this like health and wellness thing in the right way.
It's the MAGA moment.
It's the MAGA moment, which is like, as a person who's been like begging people to eat that stuff for a decade, not because it was good for you, even though I'm glad it is good for you, but because it's delicious. And then seeing that it become this like health food is super fascinating.
And you left out some of the specialty cocktails, which have some fun names.
Right. So on a normal night, the cocktails have very pedestrian names, mostly related, not pedestrian, I guess, but very normal names related to some of Ernest Hemingway's books, related to the spirit that's in the cocktail. But during private events, people are allowed to name their own specialty cocktails. So like Steve's parties, like there was like an espresso martini called like a Covfefe martini. My favorite one recently is we did a penicillin, which is a Scotch cocktail. But Steve always has like 3 pins in his shirt tucked sideways. Have you noticed
Famously.
this?
Yeah.
So we had a cocktail for him called a 3 penicillin day, which is funny because he doesn't drink, but a 3 penicillin day sounds like a blast.
And if people came to this restaurant, would they see you in the kitchen? Or are you out and about on the floor?
I'm at the host stand almost every night. A big part of like making this place work as a destination for people to see and be seen is like managing the reservation book, making sure sort of people who are feuding with each other don't get sat next to each other, making sure clients get the table that they like or the one that they said they liked last time they were in. So I'm at the host stand almost every night, just sort of playing Jenga with the room, making sure it all works.
And why is this crowd not as interested this go around in establishment places like Le Dip, Cafe Milano? Historically, these have been the go-to spots no matter what party is in power.
Yeah, I won't even pretend those places aren't still full because they definitely are.
For sure. But this place is getting all the buzz.
We are getting all the buzz. It's a great question. I'm going to fumble this one. I really should have a better answer. I think our attention to detail and like our customer service exceeds a lot of restaurants in the area. So we have a meeting 2 hours before service every day where we go over every single reservation that's coming in that night. And like, we have their face printed. We have their job title. We have everything laid out. We have like what they ordered last time they were in. We pay a lot of attention to the people who come in. And I think being treated that way, especially for the sort of MAGA crowd, again, we have both, but for the MAGA crowd, after, I don't know, 8 years of, if you remember during the first administration, there was like restaurants that would just actively refuse to serve them. There were restaurants where like protesters would come in and throw a bucket of paint on the person.
Governor Huckabee was kicked out of a restaurant. Stephen Miller as well.
Yep. Half the cabinet had the same problems. I think President Trump himself had that problem during the first administration with a place that I can't remember the name of right now. And I think knowing that that's not going to happen, and knowing even more than that, knowing that you're going to be treated like a normal person, like an active person who's paying money to eat my food, just really goes a long way after 8 years of sort of being treated like worse than criminals.
And the closing of the Trump International Hotel, that certainly left an opening for you guys to take. There are rumors that the Trump Hotel is coming back. What do you make of those? Does it worry you? What have you heard?
It doesn't worry me, first and foremost, because I think we've established ourselves at this point and we do a very different thing than they did. And I think tastes have changed. I think the center of gravity has just changed. And then just on a really technical level, I don't worry about it because hotel deals don't happen overnight. So even if they announced today that they were buying it, I'd be surprised if they were open by the midterms.
And what's next for you? Do you want to open more locations? Do you have another concept that's coming up?
I've got a few things in the works. I wish any of them were done enough to talk about. But this will not be the last thing we do in DC.
And what are the chances that you could get the president to show up at the restaurant?
I think, and I've heard murmurings that there have sort of been questions about him coming. I think I don't know if we will get him, just for a very technical reason, which is like we don't have a back door. And Secret Service really hates that. I've worked in restaurants where presidents past have come, and the Secret Service process for getting the president in the room and securing it are like a logistical nightmare, to be perfectly honest. And I don't know if we'll get him because of that. But I'd be happy to have him.
Well, congrats on all of the success. I wish you all the best, and can't wait to dine there soon.
Hey, thanks, Andrew.
Thank you for watching and listening to The Golden Age. If you have any comments, please drop us a line at goldenage@politicon.com. Stay tuned for more episodes every week. You can watch us on Politicon's YouTube channel or subscribe to The Golden Age with Andrew Zucker podcast wherever you listen. Don't forget to check us out on Politicon's socials on Instagram, Facebook, and Blue Sky, and follow, subscribe, and comment. We'd love to hear from you. And please spread the word about us. This was our first episode, and we're so excited to tell your friends, tell everyone, and give it a 5-star review. It really helps other people find it. I can't wait to see you on the next episode of The Golden Age.